Hi, Soccer 101 students. I'm just recording here quite a brief lecture, brief recording about some issues that you need to start to be aware of and understand for writing essays. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about academic integrity. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to use Turnitin, what it's for, how we as markers use it, and how you as students can use it. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means by using high quality sociological sources, and talk a little bit at the end about referencing. I suppose before I start on that though, is one of the questions we still get in courses is, why do you make us write essays? You don't really have to write essays very much outside of an academic or kind of study context, I suppose. So I think the way to think about what we're helping you to learn here is that there's no real such thing as being able to write without being in a particular genre or context. Even things like blogs these days that seem to be the ultimate way of being able to write whatever you want increasingly have their own kind of conventions and ways of going about them. So every time we write, whether it's online or whether it's in work, and particularly in work, again, there's lots of different forms of writing, and whether that's writing technical reports or writing an end of year report or an application for something or whatever, there's always rules and regulations about how to go about writing that form of genre. So what we're teaching you here in an academic essay setting are a couple of key things. Firstly, we're getting you to write in a kind of scientific context, and what that means is that we're encouraging a way of thinking about creating an argument to answer a question, but more specifically, to be able to kind of come to a topic with a critical mindset, to be able to understand what evidence is, what's good evidence and bad evidence, how to make an argument about the point you want to make, and how to then be able to organise that into a coherent kind of piece of writing. So broadly, that's what essay writing is for. It's to be able to, I suppose, understand what good evidence is and how to make a good argument, based on already existing scientific literature. So that's the important thing we're trying to get you to do here. And while you may not write essays outside of a university context, that way of thinking, that way of writing, and that way of organising things, and the way of kind of having an orientation towards something will be an important skill in future endeavours. So this is what essays are for. They're not just about this to help us understand whether you know a particular thing in the course, whether you understand marks or whatever. They're actually encouraging a very specific way of thinking and therefore writing about things. So in terms of the four things I want to talk about in relation to essays, firstly, there's the idea of academic integrity. So academic integrity is essentially about being honest in terms of what you're writing, what you're putting in any kind of a written assessment item, whether it's an essay or a report or whatever, that it's your own work, that you haven't falsified anything. So you can see here in the essay writing guide, which you can download online, that there's kind of definitions of what these things mean. Basically, academic fraud is, this array of stuff. Really, the one that applies most for essay writing is reusing your own work from other courses, or putting stuff in your essays that's from either other students or from sources that you don't reference properly. One of the things that students are often surprised about is they can't put in the same stuff into different courses or in different assessment items in the same course. You always need to be writing new things for those courses, so you can't plagiarise yourself. That is still a form of plagiarism. You're not allowed to do that, and it is one of the few things that Turnitin is really good at picking up on, so please don't do that. More broadly though, the main form of plagiarism, which is a specific type of academic integrity problem, which is again defined here in the essay writing guide, is the use of other people's work, whether it's researchers, sociologists, journalists, whatever, that's used in an essay that isn't referenced correctly, and I'll get into the referencing later on. So these are the kind of specific things that we're concerned about when it comes to academic integrity. Basically, there's a whole bunch of things that you're not allowed to do, but if you go into doing your assessment with the right spirit, that is making sure that at all times when you're drawing on other people's work or from other sources, that you reference that material, for the most part you'll be right, because there's kind of a couple of things that are going on here. There's the technical aspects of referencing, which is getting the references in the right spot all the time. But really, referencing is about doing the right thing in terms of acknowledging the work that's gone on before, acknowledging all the ideas and concepts and research that's happened in the past, that you haven't really come up with those, and you then pay homage to those in terms of pointing out where they actually came from. In an essay in a sociology course, for instance, there's very little room for you to write your own thing. We don't want your opinion or experiences. We need you basically to be drawing on other sources all the time. Essentially, the essays in this course are asking you to draw upon a very well-established history of literature, whether it's around gender or class or race and ethnicity or globalization or whatever, and to use those ideas to mount the argument to answer the question. And to the evidence that you need to gather to answer the question, you also have to go to an already well-established canon of literature, which is the research in the field that kind of, you can use to answer that question. So really, you have to be drawing upon other people's work, published good quality sociology all the way through these essays. When it comes to Turnitin, which is the second thing I wanted to talk about today, there is often some confusion about what Turnitin is and what it's for and how it's used. I know that some academics use Turnitin from what I think is an incorrect way, where they will tell their students that you can't have more than 25% match, and anything over that is plagiarism. So that's really not the way Turnitin is meant to be used. Turnitin certainly picks up all the things that match in a text, but it's up to the marker to then interpret if those matches are fair enough or if they're actually, forms of plagiarism. So in the LREP exercise that you've done in this course, you would have already seen what happens in Turnitin. That in an example like this, when it comes to the bibliographical details that are in the Turnitin, they're always going to match, because these sources are going to be used in the many thousands of essays that are handed in every year across all the universities in the world that use Turnitin. So in an assessment item like this one, for instance, there's going to be a relatively decent percentage that's going to match, because these things are going to be used before. In terms of the LREP, we expected these things to match, but it was the bits you write yourself that shouldn't have any matches in them. So when it comes to it, we open these things up. This is what we see. Now, I can't actually do it on the example here because I've had to use PDFs to anonymize these assessment items. But when we open Turnitin, we can then click on these numbers, and then it opens up specifically, where that's coming from. So if it is a block of text, we can actually see very quickly the original source and, very much come to a conclusion about, whether you've cut and pasted or not. But the reason I'm kind of pointing this out is that there's matches that are plagiarism and there's matches that aren't. So if I was to open up an essay that looked like this, you can see very quickly, that even though there's a reference there, that these are actually direct quotes. This has been cut and pasted, so they've put a reference in, but because it's quotes, you needed quote marks in this stuff. So putting a reference in all the time isn't necessarily what stops it being plagiarism. If you're using the direct words, you need to also put in quote marks around those words as well. But again, very quickly, when we open up an essay like this, we can, Turnitin's very good at pointing out where all this is. But for instance, if these matches had quote marks around it, we wouldn't have gone to this student and say, hey, you've plagiarized here. We probably still would have got a poor mark for using way too many quotes and not writing in your own voice and all that kind of stuff. But these examples, therefore, wouldn't have been plagiarism because they would have had quote marks around them. So this is an example of how markers use Turnitin to judge, what matches mean. The matches themselves don't always necessarily mean it's plagiarism, because if you reference correctly, like in this example, again, there's a passage here which has quite a few matches. You would open it up and maybe, if you didn't, you could think there was something suspicious going on, but when you look at this in more detail, you can see that this has actually been referenced really thoroughly. The red marking here where the exact quote meets, there's quote marks there, and then there's a reference with page numbers. It's always a good practice to have a page number when you use a reference in a quote. All the matches through here that are actual matches are quotes, and then they've been referenced accordingly. So these are, this is kind of, I wanted to highlight here what Turnitin is for. The percentage is important in the sense that if, you have a 1,500 word essay and, 75% of it matches, it means there's something wrong, or even maybe 40% matches, but really the number itself's not what's important. We open it up and then see what's plagiarism or what's not. If you do have a higher match but you've got lots of quotes, you'll likely still get a poor mark, but at least that's not plagiarism. So again, there's a distinction here between what's matches, what kind of matches are problematic and what's not. Okay, so the third thing I want to talk about is high quality sources and what to use. So this isn't a thing that's been a problem that we find most years out of the LREP, is that we ask you to look for 6 sources, and people tend to then just use Google quite often. Whatever comes up on top they use. And the other thing that happens quite regularly too with high quality, with not using the right sources is, in a course that's an introduction to sociology, is they don't use sociological sources. So really, in this course, we definitely want you to be using work that comes from sociology. So for most parts, journalism, psychology, history, these might have interesting things to say about the topic, but we want you to be drawing upon sociology to answer the essay questions. It's again, what some of the problems here in terms of, I think, what students that causes the problems for students is a matter of genre as well. So you'll notice, in lectures or even in tutes or whatever, we might refer you to like read this newspaper article or a journalistic opinion piece or investigative journalist piece or whatever. And then I think students get a little bit confused that we then, because we recommended them to, as an example, to kind of get you to understand something in the course, that therefore they are legitimate sources to use in an essay. And so that's definitely not the case. So again, quality academic sources for an essay are different than, a source we might use in a lecture, just to kind of illustrate a point. So when it comes to using sources that are reliable, high quality sociological academic sources, we need you to be drawing upon journal articles that are published in sociological journals, or books, that are written about the topic, whether you're doing class or gender, by sociologists. Most of the time we want you to be using as recent stuff as possible, but again, there's a bit of leeway here. Much of the key theorists in the course are, dead white males really, so, if you're going to be writing about Marx and you're using the primary sources, those texts are quite old, and that's a legitimate thing to use. Same with Bourdieu, he died in 2002, so, really, when it comes to the primary texts and the key sociologists that we've been talking about in the course, they're often relatively older books. So they're fine to use, but when it comes to journal articles, in particular, when the ones that you're using as evidence that have data in them, whether that's a statistic, from a quantitative study, or some interview work that, has someone talking about their, class inequalities or whatever, we need those to be much more recent. In the last 10 years in particular is probably a kind of rule of thumb. We won't be kind of, saying this paper from 2008 is no good or whatever, but like just as a general rule, the spirit of what the stuff you should be using here, as recent as possible when it comes to using research and empirical papers in particular. When it comes to knowing what journals to use and what's legitimate, definitely the journals with sociology in their title are good. Journal of Sociology, British Journal of Sociology, Sociological Review, Current Sociology, Cultural Sociology, there's lots of them. There are more kind of specific journals that might be about gender or ethnicity or about globalization that are more interdisciplinary. So they'll have stuff in it that's sociological as well, but then you need to be a little bit more careful drawing out of those. So again, try and make good decisions about using sociological sources as much as possible. So please take that advice about using good quality sources really seriously. If you're not using good quality sources, you simply won't be getting good marks in your essay. This is something that in a first year essay we're, very much looking for. Of course, it's like I was talking about earlier on, we're looking here to teach you skills to write in a scientific context. And one of the skills that's important, therefore, is knowing and using the good quality legitimate sources for the particular thing that you're writing. The last thing that I want to talk about is referencing, and you're going to get some more stuff about the technical aspects of referencing in the course proper, but I'm just going to briefly talk more about the spirit of it, I suppose. So again, when you're using other sources, every time you use a source, you need to reference them straight away. This is pretty much what an in-text reference should look like. Now, I know it can get really confusing. There's, Harvard referencing and all these different types of referencing. But for the most part, if you have the year, the date, and a page number, you'll be right. I know some just say year and date and don't say about page number. I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute in terms of technicalities. But we definitely want you to use Harvard in this course. And we know that it can be really confusing, where to put the italics and the commas and, volume, issue number and page number and, all that kind of stuff, and how to put semicolons and all that kind of thing. That's technically difficult, and you should be paying attention and trying to get that stuff right. But we know that in an introductory course, when this is all new, that some of those things are going to go a bit amiss sometimes. So while if you do that really badly in an essay, you'll lose some marks, really, when it comes to referencing, the most important things is to do referencing in the right spirit, to ensure that every time, as much as possible, that you're using other people's sources, other people's work, that you put a reference in and you make it as accurate as possible. Now, this is particularly the case in the in-text referencing, that throughout paragraphs you're referencing regularly, and also at the end in the bibliography, that you try and get most of those details right, get them in the right order. And if you've done that to the best you can, and you have a few mistakes here and there with commas or whatever, that's going to be fine, and you'll learn from that and move later on into second year or whatever. It's really here we're very much concentrating on the spirit of referencing. What referencing is about you acknowledging you're using other people's sources and pointing out specifically in the essay as you go that you're doing that each time. Now, again, in the essay writing guide that's on Blackboard, we have some really specific and technical instructions about how to do that. There's all kinds of stuff here about how to, in the bibliography, how to list things and all that kind of stuff. So please go through and have a look at that. Again, there's a whole bunch of other suggestions here as well. But I think I'll go down here to the examples. Example of a introduction there. In a paragraph, this is a kind of good example of a paragraph, I suppose, out of an essay. Notice how regularly this is being referenced. So it's not just after quotes, it's after when things are paraphrased, but you can see this is very much referencing, very regularly throughout, showing exactly where all this different information comes from. You can see this is why this is also good as well, because one thing that happens a lot in essays in first year is that whole paragraphs tend to rely on the one source. It's always good to be weaving together different sources as much as possible. So again, please try and go into this with the idea of the spirit of referencing as much as you can, making an effort to acknowledge when using other sources as accurately as possible. Now, I mentioned there that I'd like you to use page numbers as much as possible. Let me just kind of touch upon that. So, for instance, if you were writing a book about an essay about globalization, and you in 2 sentences outlined the kind of what the book Risk Society by Ulrich Beck is about. Ulrich Beck writes about Risk Society, where the changes to the world over the last couple of years due to globalization has shifted the world from a class society to a risk society. If you were to write something like that, okay, you could get away with writing Beck 1992 at the end of that. But really what we want you to be doing throughout is your essays are being more specific than that. For the most part, you'll be drawing upon work that's on specific pages in the book. You won't be kind of summarising the whole thing. And so what we want you to do as much as possible is be really specific in your referencing. This works in a few ways. When you're taking notes or when you're going through sources, you should always take a note of the page that you're getting it from, so you can use that later on, because really if you're not referencing accurately like that, you are kind of shifting down the slippery pole of academic integrity there. For instance, we often get, a reference to a book like this, Bourdieu's on the State. Those people might, get the definition of cultural capital out of it. that might be on page, say, I don't know, 110, and they'll put, Bourdieu 2010, and they'll leave it at that without a page number. Really what that implies is you've read the whole book. If you put in Bourdieu 2010, you're intimating to me as a marker that you've read the whole thing and you know where it's from. Really, that's never really going to have been the case. So what we want you to do, and what we want you to get in the habit of doing, is being as specific as possible with referencing. Reference to the page number where you get the definition from or where you get the data from, and that will not only mean that you're referencing as accurately as possible, but you'll get into really good habits of study, and that'll become the norm and become much easier for you to do that throughout the rest of your university study. Another thing to think about there is something like, a theorist or a sociologist like Bourdieu or Marx or whatever often change the definitions of their concepts over time. So something like Bourdieu's idea of habitus, for instance, has had a multiplicity of different definitions between when he first started writing about it in the 60s up until his death in 2002. So again, to move into upper echelons of the marks here towards distinctions and HDs, for you to point out that you're using that very specific, definition or concept or whatever from that point, from that book, allows you to kind of flag to the marker that you're kind of going into this stuff into some depth. But overall here, what I'm trying to encourage is that to ensure that you follow the spirit of marking as much as possible, that you make every effort you can to reference accurately and often, and throughout it, as I've already said an essay in sociology, it's rare that you're going to be able to just write about yourself. Basically, you need to be drawing upon conceptual sociological work and empirical sociological work to weave together to answer these questions. Okay, so I think I've gone through everything I want to go through there. We'll be providing more material over for you to use over the next week or two as well for the essays, and we'll also be talking about essay writing in tutes over the next few weeks as well. When it comes to asking questions about essays, please ensure that you do this in tutorials. I won't be encouraging our tutors to be, responding via email to detailed questions about essay writing. You should be in tutes learning about this stuff as much as you can. Really, our tutors don't get paid to be doing that stuff outside of tutes as well. So, go to tutorials and talk to your tutors about essay advice. Really, I know that sometimes people are reluctant to ask questions because they feel like they might be asking a stupid question or whatever. But really, you'll find that it's quite often the question that you want to know the answer to that other people in the class will want to know as well. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Good luck with your essays.